August 1911, 42 miles north of Charters Towers, deep within the unforgiving Queensland outback. A family of 6 lives on a remote cattle station, entirely isolated from the rest of the world. Then the nightmare begins. It doesn't start with a scream, but with something massive testing the boundaries of their cattle yard in the dead of night. Something heavier than a dingo. Something that walks on 2 legs, leaving 22-inch footprints pressed deep into the sun-baked clay. By the second week of August, we knew something was watching us. By the third week, we knew it wasn't alone. This is a terrifying true account of the 11-day siege on Aldridge Station and why my family abandoned everything we had ever built. Welcome to Late Night Stories. I am Thomas Harold Aldridge. I am writing this in Brisbane in the winter of 1972. I am 77 years old, and for 61 years, I have carried the silence. People sometimes ask why I waited so long to put this to paper. The truth is, no one asked until now, and I spent most of my adult life trying to forget. I tried to bury it beneath decades of ordinary living, beneath work and family and the loud, distracting noises of the modern world. But there are things a man carries that only get heavy with language, and conversely, some burdens fester and rot the longer they stay wordless. For 6 decades, I kept this locked away in the darkest corner of my mind. But the memories have not faded. If anything, age has sharpened them. I can still smell the dust. I can still hear the wire groaning. In the winter of 1911, I was 16 years old. My family lived on a massive, sprawling 2,000-acre scrub and open country selection we called Aldridge Station. My father, Harold Aldridge, had claimed the land 7 years earlier, in 1904. To understand this story, you have to understand the kind of man my father was. He was a formidable, fearless man of 41 that winter. He possessed forearms like iron fence posts and a jaw that had been broken twice in violent stockwork accidents, leaving it set permanently and slightly off-center on his weathered face. He did not frighten. He did not back down. He believed that the earth yielded to the man who struck it the hardest. My mother, Edna, ran the homestead. She was 38, fiercely practical, and woven from the same tough fiber as the land itself. She was the sort of woman who could calmly set her own broken finger, bind it in a splint, and go right back to kneading bread dough before the swelling even had a chance to rise. She read my father like a well-worn book, understanding everything he didn't say. My siblings were Clara, who was 12 and possessed a quiet, observant intelligence; Jack, who was 10, full of practical questions and a desperate desire to be treated like a man; and little Ruth, the baby of the family, who was just 4 years old. We also had a rugged, deeply callous stockman named Bert Collins living on the property that season. Bert was in his mid-40s, a man with one eye that tended to wander left when he was exhausted, and hands so thickly scarred he could pull barbed fencing wire without wearing gloves. He had come out from Townsville looking for work after a bad mustering season, and my father had hired him at 8 shillings a week to help bring in the cattle. We were entirely, profoundly on our own. In 1911, 42 miles of dirt track meant you were effectively living on another planet. If disaster struck, help was not coming. Our nearest neighbor, the McAllister family, was 34 miles away through dense, unforgiving bushland. The previous owner of our land, a man named Pierce, had mysteriously abandoned the property back in 1902 after lasting just 18 months. He had literally walked away from a fully built homestead. My father, seeing only opportunity, had bought the selection from the Crown for absolute pennies. By 1911, Pierce was living in Rockhampton and flatly refused to even speak of the Aldridge land to anyone who asked. If you brought it up, he would turn his back and walk out of the room. The locals in town simply called the thick, impenetrable bush north of our property Hairy Man Country. We all assumed it was just old campfire folklore. Ghost stories meant to keep children from wandering off into the scrub. We were so incredibly wrong. It started on the 1st of August. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of dry winter outback cold that cracks your lips and settles deep into your joints. Before sunrise, my father went out to check the yard and found 12 head of cattle scattered far into the dense brush. When he examined the enclosure, he found the heavy 8-foot hardwood rails of the north fence compromised, but they hadn't been broken. That was a detail that lodged in my father's mind. They had been forcefully pushed inward toward the yard. Hardwood rails of that thickness do not simply bend. To move them requires immense focus leverage, and whatever had spooked the herd so badly had circled them from the tree line, pressing the massive rails inward as it paced the perimeter. My father and Bert spent the entire day riding deep into the scrub, tracking down the scattered, terrified animals. They brought them back and spent the evening reinforcing the fence, lashing the breakpoints with heavy rope. They spoke only in practical, irritated tones, like men discussing a block water bore or a broken wagon wheel. Neither of them was ready to admit what they truly suspected. Neither wanted to say aloud that something with the weight of a draft horse had pushed that fence, but had done so on 2 feet. We didn't find the tracks that first morning because they had walked the perimeter in the dim lamplight before dawn. It wasn't until the following morning, when the low sun cast long, dark shadows across the red dirt, that the truth revealed itself. I was the one who spotted the first print. I had gone out to check the troughs before breakfast. I nearly walked right past it. It was pressed so deeply into the hardened clay, in the shadow of a fence post, that my brain simply refused to categorize it correctly. It was a distinct shape of a bare foot, but it was so unfathomably large that for a moment, a wave of dizzying nausea washed over me. I called out for my father. His heavy boots crunched against the dry earth as he walked over. He looked down and he stopped. He knelt beside the impression in total silence for what felt like an eternity. He didn't speak. He just stared. Then he placed his own large hand down inside the print, spreading his fingers from thumb to little finger to measure it. "That's 3 spans across," he whispered. His hand span was about 8 inches. The print was nearly 2 feet long and 10 inches wide. We walked the scrub line and found 6 more prints in the softest parts of the earth. The stride between them, the distance from one footfall to the next, was an impossible 6 feet. My father had to stretch his legs to their absolute limit just to mimic the distance. Bert stood a few paces back, staring at the dirt. His voice was hushed, almost a croak. We finally muttered that no man on earth had a foot like that. My father simply nodded slowly and agreed. That evening, the atmosphere inside the homestead changed. The comforting warmth of the iron oven and the smell of stew felt like a thin veil over a deep, black pit. My father opened the heavy leather station ledger and meticulously documented the terrifying reality. I watched him write 6 prints, 22 to 24 inches in length, 9 to 10 inches wide, set in a walking stride of approximately 70 inches, bipedal, upright gait. He paused, staring at the ink. The ground out, there was like concrete. There had been no rain for 3 weeks. To sink 2 inches into drought-hardened Queensland clay, my father estimated the creature had to weigh somewhere between 500 and 700 pounds. He went out that night and double-lashed the fences. He walked around the homestead, checking that every single heavy wooden shutter closed perfectly flush, and that the heavy iron bolt on the front door was seated deep into its keep. He didn't say a word to my mother about the prints, but she already knew. She had seen the sheer, uncharacteristic pallor of his face when he came inside. The second night brought no broken fences, but it brought something infinitely more unsettling. At dawn, all 30 head of cattle were huddled shoulder to shoulder in the farthest southern corner of the yard. They were pressed so tightly together they looked like a single, trembling mass of hide and horn. They were facing the northern tree line in absolute, paralyzed silence. They hadn't made a single sound all night. We could tell from the dung pattern that they had stood exactly in that spot, completely rigid, for hours. Then, on the morning of August 4th, the dog vanished. His name was Patch. He was a seasoned, tough red cattle dog who had worked the harsh land with Bert for 2 seasons. He was entirely fearless, the kind of dog that would snap at the heels of a 2,000-pound bull without blinking. He always slept in the dirt right beneath the stockman's veranda. When Bert woke up in the cold pre-dawn air, Patch was gone. We searched the immediate area. We found him 40 yards away, near the dark edge of the scrub. I will never forget the sight of it. He hadn't been killed like a dingo's prey. When wild dogs take an animal, there is chaos. There is torn earth, scattered fur, yelping, and noise. There were no bite marks at his throat. There was no sign of a desperate struggle where we found him. Instead, there was just a continuous, thin smear of blood in the dirt. It began roughly 20 yards from Bert's quarters. It looked exactly as though Patch had been quietly scooped up, carried in the darkness, and then dragged for the final distance. Bert was a notoriously light sleeper from years of sleeping rough on the droving trails. A snapping twig would usually wake him, yet he had heard absolutely nothing. The cattle had heard nothing. Whatever came out of the trees for the dog that night was massive, precise, and entirely terrifyingly silent. That morning, the illusion of safety shattered. My father quietly told my mother to sit down. I was standing in the hallway, meant to be doing chores, but I listened. He spoke in a low, tight voice, telling her that there was an animal in the scrub, a very large one, and that he intended to sit up on the veranda that night with his rifle to get a clear look at it. My mother didn't argue. She simply walked over to the table, looked at the chilling measurements written in his open ledger, and asked how long it would take to get a letter to town. Bert rode out at dawn the next day to post a letter from McAllister Place. Bert made the brutal 68-mile round trip in a single day. For an old stockman to refuse the hospitality of a warm bed at the neighbor's house and push his horse to the brink just to get back behind our locked doors before nightfall, that was a terrifying testament to how panicked Bert truly was. That night, my father sat in a heavy wooden chair on the veranda. He had his .303 Linfield rifle resting across his knees, a round already chambered. The kerosene lamp was turned down to a mere orange sliver. I lay awake in my bed, fully dressed, listening to the agonizing silence of the bush. At 2 a.m, the door to my room creaked open. My father stood there. He didn't say a word. He just gestured for me to follow him. We stepped out onto the freezing veranda. He pointed out toward the north, toward the black line of the trees roughly 60 yards away. The sky was clear, and a pale half-moon cast a ghostly, silver light over the clearing. Standing there, perfectly framed between two massive eucalyptus trees, was a silhouette. It was standing upright, and it was colossal. My brain tried to shrink it, tried to tell me it was a trick of the shadows or a strangely shaped stump. But I knew the height of the fence posts. The posts were 6 feet tall. This thing dwarfed them. It stood at least 9 feet from the earth. Its shoulders were unervingly broad, sloping down into arms that hung entirely too long, ending past its knees. It didn't move a muscle. It was just standing there, observing the house, observing us. We watched it for 10 agonizing minutes. The silence was so absolute it rang in my ears. I waited for the deafening crack of my father's rifle. I waited for him to raise the barrel and put an end to this nightmare. But he didn't. He sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the wood of the stock, so tightly his knuckles were white in the moonlight. Years later, he confessed to me why he didn't shoot. This was a man who had shot charging wild boars from the back of a galloping horse. He told me that as he stared at that massive, silent shape, he felt in his very marrow that if he raised that gun, he would cross a threshold. He felt that if he fired, he would trigger a response so violent, so unstoppable, that none of us would survive the night. He recognized with a primal, ancient instinct that we were completely outmatched. Then I blinked, and in the fraction of a second it took for my eyes to open, the space between the trees was completely empty. There was no rustle of leaves, no thud of heavy footsteps retreating. It was just gone. By the morning of August 6th, my father stopped pretending this was a problem we could solve. He locked the house down with a grim, methodical focus. He took heavy iron nails and permanently sealed the north-facing shutters from the inside. The house became a dark, sweltering bunker. He moved his rifle and every single round of ammunition we possessed to a table directly beside the front door. He ordered Bert to abandon the stockman's quarters entirely and move his bedding into the main house. When my father went out alone to scout the dense scrub along the northern boundary later that day, he returned with a face carved from stone. He told my mother he had found more tracks in the soft earth beneath the canopy, but they weren't just the massive ones. There was a second set, slightly smaller, overlapping the first on the same path. There was more than one. That night, the siege truly escalated. We were no longer just being watched. They were communicating. Around 9 o'clock, after my younger siblings had been put to bed, a sound erupted from the deep scrub to the north. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't a growl. It was a deep, resonating vocalization, like absolutely nothing on this earth. It rumbled from a massive chest cavity, carrying a bizarre, deliberate modulation. It went up in pitch, then down, dragging out for 4 terrifying seconds before abruptly stopping. It was so deep, we could feel the vibration of it in the floorboards. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, seconds later, from the dark scrub to the east, a different voice answered. This one was slightly higher, shorter in duration, but just as powerful. And then from the south, a third voice called out. 3 of them, positioned in a perfect, calculated triangle completely surrounding our homestead. My father whispered for us to extinguish the remaining lamps. We sat in total, suffocating darkness. My mother sat in the hallway outside the bedroom, quietly telling Clara and Jack that it was just a pack of wild dogs echoing in the valley. Clara was 12. She was old enough to know exactly what a dingo sounded like. She knew her mother was lying, but she was young enough to desperately need to lie. For 2 straight hours, the calls continued. Sometimes they would growl in a low, vibrating hum. Other times, all 3 would call in a rapid sequence. At one point, their voices overlapped in a complex, terrifying rhythm. The northern voice initiated, the eastern voice responded, and the southern voice cut across them both in a distinct, measured cadence. It was not the chaotic noise of wild animals. It was a structure. It was language. They were talking about us, and they were letting us know they were there. My father lit a single candle, pulled the ledger toward me, and ordered me to write it down. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the pen, but I logged every terrifying minute. 9:07, first call. 9:14, first exchange. 9:20, 3-way overlap. We sat in the dark, prisoners in our own home, listening to the giants in the trees. By morning, the psychological warfare continued. My father went to inspect the south fence line at dawn. He found that the heavy gauge wire he had strung along the lower rails had been tampered with. It wasn't snapped or broken. 3 thick strands of fencing wire had been deliberately pulled aside, stretched to test their tension, and then carefully laid back in roughly their original position. It was a methodical test of our defenses. When he showed Bert the twisted wire, the old stockman's face crumpled. He looked at my father, his voice trembling, and said, "Harold, we need to leave. A thing that size." His voice trailed off. He didn't even need to finish the sentence. But my father was a stubborn man. His entire life savings, his blood and sweat for 7 years, was tied up in the cattle standing in that yard. He refused to run. He promised Bert and himself that we would hold out for 3 more days. On the night of August 7th, they finally grew tired of waiting in the trees. They approached the walls. It started exactly at midnight. I was standing near the east side window of the main room. The house was pitch black. Suddenly, we heard a sound against the corrugated iron sheeting on the north wall. It was a slow, deliberate, heavy pressure. It sounded exactly as if something immense was leaning its entire body weight flat against the side of the house, testing the strength of the timber frame. The iron groaned under the unnatural load. The sound lasted for 4 agonizing seconds and then stopped. A minute later, it happened again, further down the wall toward the corner. Push, groan, release. The entity was methodically walking the perimeter of the house, feeling for weaknesses. Inside, the tension was unbearable. My father stood in the center of the room, gripping the heavy rifle. Bert stood near the hallway, his knuckles white around the handle of an axe. My mother was huddled in the back bedroom with her arms wrapped tightly around the younger children. Then, the pressure against the north wall ceased. There was silence for several minutes, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, expectant silence of a predator closing in. I was standing frozen by the eastern shutter. I heard a faint crunch of dry dirt directly outside the window. Whatever had been at the north wall had silently moved around the corner. It stopped directly on the other side of the wood, less than 2 feet from my face. And then it exhaled. It was a long, slow, cavernous release of breath, clearly audible through the microscopic gaps in the shutter boards. The sheer lung capacity required to push out that much air was paralyzing, and with the breath came the smell. It seeped through the cracks, flooding the room. It was ancient, foul, and undeniably animal, a mixture of rotting earth, copper, and damp, matted fur. My stomach violently heaved, but I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound. My father moved with absolute silence. He crossed the floorboards, placing himself right beside me. He pressed the cold steel barrel of his rifle directly against the wooden frame of the shutter, his ear turned toward the wood. We waited. We couldn't breathe. The entity on the other side of the wall made no further sound, save the slow, rhythmic drawing of air into its massive lungs. It was listening to us just as intently as we were listening to it. After 3 excruciating minutes, it decided it was done. We heard its weight shift. 3 unimaginably heavy footsteps thudded into the hard clay. Boom, boom, boom. Each step sent a faint vibration traveling through the ground, up through the stump of the house, and directly into the soles of our boots. And then it faded into the night. My father stood frozen at the window for 20 minutes before he finally lowered the rifle. He walked over to the table, his hands visibly shaking for the first time in his life, and opened the ledger. He wrote, 1 individual at north and east wall, direct structure approach, physical contact with wall, breathing audible from interior, duration of wall presence, approximately 12 minutes. He heavily underlined the word direct. By the 8th of August, the terror had infected the livestock completely. The cattle were refusing to eat or drink. The water in the trough was untouched. They remained wedged in the southern corner, their eyes wide and rolling with constant panic. That morning, my father realized the terrifying reality of our situation. If the house was breached, he couldn't save us all. He pulled my 12-year-old sister, Clara, aside. He looked her dead in the eyes and gave her the most chilling instruction a father can give a child. He told her that if anything happened, if the doors came down and he couldn't give her orders, she was to grab her little brother Jack, pull 4-year-old Ruth up onto the saddle with her, and ride the fastest horse south toward the McAllister Station. She was not to stop for anything. She was not to look back. And if I, her older brother, fell behind her pace, she was to leave me behind and save the younger ones. Clara nodded. That night, they stopped hiding in the shadows entirely. They wanted us to see them. My father cracked the north shutter, just 1/4 of an inch at midnight. He called me over. Standing boldly at the dark edge of the tree line, illuminated by the pale moonlight, were all 3 of them. They were spaced about 30 yards apart, towering over the scrub. The one on the far left was a true giant, noticeably larger and wider than the other 2. They weren't roaring. They weren't charging the fence. They were simply standing there, staring at the homestead. It was a pure, unadulterated display of power. They knew we were inside, trembling behind our locked doors. They knew we were watching them through the cracks. They wanted to show us exactly what they were, how immense they were, and how many of them there were. They stood completely motionless for 40 minutes. Then, with a chilling calmness, the massive one turned its back to us and strode heavily into the thick scrub, snapping branches as it went. The other 2 remained for 10 more minutes before following suit. It was a coordinated, deliberate withdrawal. The breaking point arrived the very next day. A young steer completely vanished from the cattle yard. The fence was perfectly intact. The ropes were tied exactly as my father had left them. The animal hadn't escaped. It had been lifted. My father found the carcass 30 yards deep into the dense scrub. He examined the remains for a long time. When he returned, his face was the color of ash. He told Bert that the manner in which the 1,000-pound animal had been killed and dismantled was not consistent with a dingo pack. It was not consistent with a scrub python. Those were the 2 rational explanations he had been desperately clinging to. Both were gone now. Still, his pride wouldn't let him leave. He told my mother we would wait one more night. But that afternoon, my sister Clara broke. She came out on the veranda, her face pale, her eyes hollow, and confessed a secret she had been hiding for 3 days. She told me that 3 nights prior, when the creature had been pressing its weight against the walls of the house, the baby, Ruth, had woken up and started to cry. Clara had panicked. Terrified the noise would provoke the things outside, she scooped Ruth up and walked over to the bedroom window. The room was stiflingly hot, and without thinking, Clara reached out and unlatched the shutter, cracking it open just an inch to let the cool night air hit the baby's face. But when she looked out through the narrow crack, she didn't see the dark yard. She saw a face. It was wide, dark, and covered in thick, coarse hair, and its eyes, massive, dark, and catching the faint ambient light of the moon, were pressed right up against a gap. It wasn't looking at the house. It was looking directly through the crack. It was looking right at her. Clara told me she was so paralyzed by a primal, suffocating terror that she couldn't even draw a breath to scream. She slowly pulled the shutter closed, locked it, fell to the floor with the baby, and wept in absolute silence until dawn. She hadn't told our parents because she knew that if they realized the monsters were looking directly into the rooms where we slept, the fragile illusion of our safety would shatter completely. When I recounted this to my father, the last of his stubborn resolve evaporated. He walked over to his ledger, recorded my sister's chilling encounter, closed a heavy leather cover, and turned to Bert. "We leave tomorrow at first light," he said. Our final night on Aldridge Station was a psychological torture I cannot fully describe. At 11 o'clock, the remaining cattle began to emit a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. It wasn't the sound of a panic stampede. It was a low, vibrating, communal moan of sheer, unadulterated horror. It built slowly, rising from the yard like a physical wave of despair, as if every single animal in the herd understood simultaneously that death was standing at the fence. My father went to the shutter and looked out. He narrated what he saw in a cold, detached whisper. All three entities had emerged from the scrub. They were standing at the north fence, pressing their massive hands against the top hardwood rail. They weren't trying to smash it. They were slowly, deliberately pressing their immense body weight against the wood. My father watched in horror as the thick hardwood rails bowed and flexed in the moonlight under their terrifying strength. They were showing us how easily they could snap our final defense. The silent show of force went on for 20 agonizing minutes. Then, as abruptly as they had arrived, the pressure on the fence stopped. They retreated. The cattle continued their horrific moaning for another half hour before collapsing into an exhausted silence. At 3 a.m, under the cover of absolute darkness, my father gave the order. We packed frantically. We took the 3 horses, the ledger, my mother's small metal tin containing the family's savings, the rifle, and our last 14 rounds of ammunition. We left the clothing. We left the tools. We left the cattle in the yard with water. We left our entire life's work to rot. As we stood on the porch, my father did something that struck me as profoundly strange in the moment. He pulled the heavy front door shut and locked it with a heavy brass padlock. I realized later why he did it. He was a proud man. He wanted anyone who eventually came looking for us to see a property that was securely locked, not a homestead abandoned in a blind panic. He was clinging to the appearance of order even as our world collapsed into chaos. We rode out just as the sky began to bleed a pale, cold gray. It was 4:58 a.m. on August 11th, 1911. 6 terrified people on 3 overloaded horses, moving as fast as we dared down the dirt track toward Charter's towers. My father rode at the absolute rear, sitting backward in his saddle with his rifle raised, refusing to look forward until we cleared the first major bend in the road that finally put the homestead out of sight. About a mile down the track, a sound echoed from the deep scrub to the west. It was a single, immensely loud, deep, modulated vocalization. It rolled over the hills, lasting for several long seconds before fading into the wind. It did not repeat. It was a monstrous farewell. They were watching us leave. We rode relentlessly, pushing the horses to their limits, and reached the McAllister Station by 1 p.m. They took us in without asking a single question. That evening, as the fire crackled in their hearth, my father sat with Mr. McAllister and poured out the entire horrifying ordeal. McAllister sat in his chair, smoking his pipe, listening to every word without interrupting. When my father finally finished, McAllister was quiet for a long time. Then he leaned forward and looked my father in the eye. "You're not the first off that land, Harold," he said softly. He revealed the truth about Pierce, the previous owner. Pierce hadn't just moved on. He had fled his property in 1902 in the exact same condition we had, in the dark, before dawn, leaving everything behind. A neighbor had found him wandering the track, half mad with terror, refusing to speak a word about what had driven him from his home. The next morning, my father opened the ledger one last time. He documented our departure. Party of 6, 3 horses, 14 rounds ammunition, all personnel unharmed, station abandoned, cattle left in yard. Then beneath it, he wrote his final summary of the nightmare. Entity count, minimum 3. Entity size, 9-foot minimum height estimated. Behavior, territorial, coordinated, deliberate. Recommend permanent abandonment of northern selection. He sold the 2,000-acre selection back to the Crown the following year for £5 below its already pitiful assessed value. Nobody else ever took up the lease. The land sat dark and unoccupied for decades. In the 1930s, a large grazing company tried to run stock on the outer edges of property, but they used hardened ringers who absolutely refused to camp overnight anywhere near the scrub. By 1941, even they had abandoned it. As far as I know, the homestead we built with our own hands slowly rotted into the earth and collapsed sometime in the 1950s. We settled in the town of Charters Towers. My father took a quiet job in the assay office. He never rode north again. He died in 1948. My mother passed away in 1961. My siblings and I practically never spoke of those 11 days, even amongst ourselves. It was a shared trauma too profound to casually discuss. I am an old man now. I know how the young look at the elderly when we tell stories of the past. I see the patient tolerance in their eyes, the private, arrogant certainty that time and age warp a man's memory. And they are right, memory does distort. The years blur the edges of ordinary days. But I am not a credulous man. I was not a credulous boy. And I will tell you what time does not distort. It does not distort the exact measurements written in ink in that leather ledger, which my sister Clara kept hidden in her home until the day she died in 1967, and which sits on the desk beside me right now. It does not distort the word direct, aggressively underlined in my father's steady hand on the August 7th entry. It does not erase the sheer, paralyzing terror of what breathed against that eastern shudder. They call him the Yowie now, or the hairy man, the big fella. The aboriginal peoples of that harsh, ancient country had names and strict, unbreakable rules regarding those entities long before any white man arrived to draw arbitrary lines on a map and call the land his own. Their rules were absolute. There's country that belongs to them. You may pass through it if you must, but you cannot stay. My father was a proud, strong man who believed he could tame any patch of dirt. He held on for 7 years, far longer than was wise, because the sheer, back-breaking labor of building a home in that brutal scrub made him feel the land owed him something. It made him feel it was his. But the land did not recognize his title. I only know what I personally saw, what I personally heard, and what I felt vibrating to the floorboards during those 11 days in the winter of 1911. I know the massive prints pressed into the hard clay. I know the silhouettes that stood the tree line, watching our tiny, fragile kerosene lamps burn in the darkness. I know the complex, booming voices that called each other through the night. And I know what my 12-year-old sister saw staring back at her when she opened the window to the dark. We left. They stayed. Because in the deep, untamed, ancient darkness of the outback, that is always how these stories end.